Opening the center immediately seeks dynamic play and prepares for rapid piece development. Sicily's Sicilian, a sharp counterpunch, immediately seizing asymmetrical control and vital central influence. Opening up central influence while developing a piece toward the action, setting the stage for an engaging Sicilian struggle. Establishing a solid pawn chain, Black prepares to contest the center and unlock their dark-squared bishop. Attacking the pinning piece is a classic idea, forcing a decision. The knight tucks away, preparing to support a central pawn push or reposition for queenside action. Bolstering the d4 advance, this solidifies White's central ambition and prepares for future pawn expansion. Instinctively developing, the knight seeks central influence, a natural response to White's solid pawn chain. Solidifying the center, this establishes a robust pawn chain and prepares for a flexible development of pieces. Solidifying the center, Black prepares to develop the kingside, potentially eyeing a queenside counterplay later. Securing the king establishes a solid foundation, allowing White to develop latent attacking potential down the central files. Developing the bishop to support castling and prepare for central pawn pushes offers solid structure. Bolstering the center's pawn chain, this rook readies for potential d4 advances and aims for a more active role on the e-file. Challenging the bishop's placement, this pawn aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially disrupt White's development. Retreating the bishop clarifies the pawn's structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks while maintaining pressure on the d6 pawn. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount, completing the defensive network with essential pawn protection. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this squares the bishop and prepares to potentially unpin the knight. Demanding space on the queenside, Black boldly challenges the bishop's outpost and seeks to develop their own pieces towards the center. Retreating the bishop solidifies control of the d4 square and prepares for future pawn pushes. Developing the bishop to b7 fortifies the queenside and eyes the d5 square, preparing for future central expansion. Securing the bishop's retreat and preventing an immediate kingside pin creates essential breathing room for White's pieces. Preventing the bishop's aggressive diagonal intrusion, this move subtly shores up the kingside but concedes a shade more central space. Seeking to bolster queenside pressure, this retreats the bishop, eyeing potential pawn breaks while maintaining defensive integrity against Black's developing initiative. Unleashing the central pawn dramatically alters the pawn structure and opens lines for potential counterplay. Shifting the bishop away from immediate confrontation allows it to survey the queenside and potentially support a future b4 pawn push. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for kingside expansion is now a priority, solidifying Black's position. Developing the knight to d2 aims to support a future kingside pawn storm, potentially clearing the way for the c-pawn. This retreat cleverly unblocks the dark-squared bishop, preparing to contest the open e-file while bolstering the kingside defense. The rook swings to the semiclosed file, preparing to support a central pawn push or create pressure on the queenside. Solidifying kingside space while preventing White's knight from improving to g5. Restricting Black's queenside expansion with a pawn advance prevents bothersome queenside pressure. Developing the bishop to this active square bolsters the queenside defenses and prepares potential counterplay against White's central pawn structure. Unlocking the queenside, this pawn push aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially gain space for White's pieces. Reinforcing the queenside and preparing a potential counterthrust on the c-file, this move also untangles the rook. A cunning knight maneuver, repositioning for a central assault or to shore up the queenside pawn structure. Opening the c-file creates immediate dynamic possibilities, challenging White's central pawn structure. Reclaiming the central pawn with cxb4 ignites a positional skirmish, aiming to destabilize Black's queenside structure and gain space. Unleashing the queen aggressively, Black immediately contests the d4 square and aims to pressure White's queenside structure, a bold gambit. liberating the knight to contest central squares and pressure black's queenside pawn structure. The bishop retreats, abandoning the vital diagonal it guarded for so long, a curious concession. Developing the bishop to a more active square, eyeing potential breaks and reinforcing central influence. Trading the rooks dramatically simplifies the position, inviting a potential queenside pawn race that needs careful monitoring. Reclaiming the center with the queen reestablishes central control, aiming to build pressure on black's somewhat cramped position. A bold thrust, black immediately challenges the center and opens lines for his pieces, though it does leave his king somewhat exposed. Reclaiming the central tension and preparing for piece redistribution across the board. Opening the d-file invites sharp exchanges, potentially exposing white's king if white doesn't react carefully to the unleashed central tension. Reclaiming the center, this pawn thrust invigorates white's central presence and opens crucial diagonals. Initiating a knight maneuver to the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially attack on g3. Reclaiming the central pressure, this squares away white's queenside development, preparing for a potential kingside initiative. Seeking central space and developing pressure on the queenside, this queen maneuver aims to prepare further pawn advances. Centering the rook opens the d-file for potential pressure and prepares to challenge black's queen. Shifting the knight to f8 clears the path for the e-pawn's advance and readies the king's flank. Unlocking a dangerous diagonal, white's bishop eyes the black king's safety across the board. Exchanges eliminate pressure, simplifying the board and potentially opening lines for the rook. Recapturing the pawn clears the d-file for your rook, potentially creating attacking avenues. The knight's jump to f4 aggressively challenges white's central control, potentially disrupting their pawn structure and opening lines for counterplay. Striking the knight on f4 cleaves black's defensive structure and opens lines, forcing a difficult reckoning. Finally, opening the e-file creates immediate tactical opportunities and forces white to defend the advanced pawn. Unlocking diagonals, this advances the pawn to seize central space and potentially disrupt black's knight development. Unleashing the queen allows for more active piece play, but leaves the king somewhat exposed to white's advancing pawns. Targeting black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure while preparing to reclaim central influence. Sacrificing the queen to force material exchange initiates a potentially favorable endgame for black. Centralizing the rook on the semi-open file leverages piece activity and threatens to infiltrate black's weakened kingside. Boldly challenging the knight, this seeks to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and open diagonal lines for counterplay. Strikes at the weakened pawn chain, creating an open path for the queen. Recapturing with the bishop activates this piece and helps to consolidate the pawn structure, aiming for a more stable middle game. The knight suddenly targets the central squares, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines. Initiating an offensive push on the kingside, aiming to exploit the potentially exposed white king and create active piece play. Pushing the rook to the 6th rank establishes significant pressure on black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Bringing the bishop back to a more active square, aiming to contest control of the central light squares. This capture immediately challenges the bishop, aiming to simplify into a potentially winning endgame with an extra pawn. Sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns is a bold attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain initiative. Unleashing the knight towards the king's flank offers active piece play and potential threats. The rook's relocation to the open file aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate black's pieces. Sacrificing material to open critical lines for the king is a bold, but potentially unsound, gambit. Initiating a forceful royal mating threat, this checks the monarch and aims to dislodge the defender. Securing your sovereign from the immediate check opens up some dynamic possibilities, even if it temporarily sacrifices pawn structure. Reigniting the initiative, the rook's foray forces white's pieces to react defensively, creating potential targets. Removing the threat simplifies the endgame and capitalizes on black's exposed king. The knight's repositioning offers a glimmer of counterplay, seeking active squares. Forking king and pawn, this check forces a critical decision, potentially liberating the knight or surrendering material. The king's sudden flight to the 7th rank reintroduces an unfortunate, exposed element into the immediate playing area. Activating the knight to a powerful outpost on d5, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially target weak squares. Shifting the king to a more active square allows it to potentially participate in the endgame or support pawn advances. Unleashing the knight to pressure black's isolated pawn chain and create tactical possibilities. Recapturing the knight opens up the a-file, offering black a chance to regroup their disorganized pieces. Clearing the path for your knight to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure. Sacrificing the bishop for pawns is a desperate attempt to complicate the endgame, but it leaves the king exposed and the opponent with a decisive material advantage. Clearing the knight from the back rank now secures the queenside pawn majority, setting up a promising endgame. The bishop retreats, abandoning the pawns and offering a strategic retreat to regroup. Activating the king offers a potential defensive shield and prepares for active participation in the endgame. Shifting the king towards the center might be the only hope for a draw, seeking activity in this pawn-down endgame. Shifting the monarch to a safer square prevents potential checks and prepares for the coming pawn race. Boldly venturing the monarch into enemy territory could prove a masterstroke or a fatal miscalculation, depending on white's response. Solidifying the king's position, white prepares to shepherd this awkward pawn structure towards a more manageable endgame. Seeking to consolidate the bishop's influence on the queen side, but potentially leaving the pawn structure a bit too open for comfort. Strengthening the king's cover against potential checks, this move prepares to activate the king itself. Relocating the king seeks refuge on the queen side, but the exposed pawn structure remains a concern. Securing the central pawn chain is paramount as the endgame solidifies. Shifting the king towards the center grants more active participation in the unfolding endgame positions. Capturing the pawn with check forces the black king further into exposure. A final exchange that surrenders the bishop pairs positional advantage for material equality in the endgame. The white monarch bravely ventures forward, spearheading the final decisive push. Solidifying the central pawn majority with the king is crucial now. Consolidating the king's position is paramount now, securing its safe passage across the board. The king marches forward, aiming to occupy the center and challenge white's pawn majority. Recapturing the pawn on c3 is a natural reaction, simplifying the position and bringing your king closer to the center. Pushing the passed pawn forward, aiming to create a late-game threat with this pawn promotion race. Opening a vital attacking avenue on the king side for white's monarch. Pushes the king towards the queen side, seeking refuge and potentially supporting pawn advances. Centering the king offers better support for the pawn advance and improves defensive positioning. Relocating the monarch offers an escape from immediate pressure, aiming for greater safety on the queen side. Pushing the pawn forward gains vital space and initiates a potentially decisive pawn storm toward black's beleaguered king. Sacrificing the pawn opens a crucial diagonal for black's king and allows the rook to become active. Securing the king is paramount as the pawn structure collapses. Initiating a pawn push to open lines, this aggressive advance aims to disrupt white's king's safety in the ensuing pawn endgame. Consolidating the king's position is paramount to preparing for the pawn race. A pragmatic regrouping, aiming to consolidate the king's position after the recent pawn capture and create potential counterplay down the central files. King needs to find a safer haven, away from the pawn's forward march. A desperate repositioning for the king, seeking safer squares as the pawns advance. Simplifying to a king and pawn endgame, white aims to create an outpost for the monarch. Shifting the king towards the center to contest the crucial central squares is a logical endgame maneuver. Activating the king to challenge the central pawns in this endgame situation is crucial for white's chances. Relocating the monarch to the center of the board is a bold endgame strategy. Bringing the king to the center consolidates control and prepares for pawn advancement. Repositioning the king to the center, seeking a more active role in the endgame's unfolding dynamics. Unleashing the pawn advances to claim territory and restrict the enemy king's escape routes. Black's king is now surprisingly safe, seeking a fortress as the pawns march forward. The king's journey to the center promises to be a decisive factor in the final showdown. Capturing the pawn with the king offers no lasting advantage and allows white's monarch to advance menacingly. Shifting the king to the f-file solidifies its position and prepares for a more active role in the endgame.